Hey, I'm Abby,
And I'm Autumn.
and this is The Right Angle, the podcast that's more about the process than the product.
Because the way we get to the story is often more complicated and more interesting than the story itself.
Today, we're joined by someone whose writing habits are both impressive and ambitious. Reagan. She's a teenage fantasy writer who's already completed several novel drafts and somehow manages to write 1,000 words a day like it's no big deal. Reagan, thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to dig into your process and hear about how you make the magic happen. So, to get us started, can you talk a little bit about how you first got into writing?
I have always been drawn to writing even before I enjoyed reading. I had my sister write before I knew how to myself while I told her what to do. And since then, I've used school computers to write as many short stories as I possibly can.
When did you start taking writing a little bit more seriously as something you want to keep doing in the future?
I got really into it when I found a story that was something I was really into and was really passionate about. And from there, I really discovered that I found out that this was definitely what I wanted to do.
Nice.
Yeah, that kind of goes into our next question for you. What kind of stories draw you in most as a writer? So, this could be stories that you like to read for inspiration or the type of stories that you most typically write.
That could even be movies or TV shows too, because those are technically stories.
Well, I have always loved fantasy, and I love creating my own world rather than using our existing one. I like stories that have a lot of emotions and kind of heavier themes. I tend to lean towards reading and writing both.
Nice. Those sound a lot of like the stories that me and Abby both really enjoy to both read and write. So, when looking at how you write, because you are a very avid writer, what does your day-to-day writing routine look like?
Well, I don't have a very organized routine. When I was writing the first draft of my novel, I wrote 1,000 words a day, as often as I could, except when I worked. And now I edit just as much as possible. I don't have a particular time, just whenever I'm feeling like it mostly.
That's really impressive to have that sort of ambition and goal and to stick with it consistently. Because I know for me, one of the hardest things right now is just consistently and finding time to consistently write because we're often so busy with school, and you also are very busy with school right now, too. And so I commend you for your ability to just stick with it. That's really impressive.
Thank you.
I also think it's really cool how you're a lot more flexible with your writing time. Because I know I'm one of those writers where if I am not writing in the morning or I don't have like a 2 hour chunk to write, I just have such a hard time getting myself to. So it's really impressive that you have that level of flexibility and, like Autumn said, the ability to just get all those words out. So that kind of flows into our next segment here. We're going to talk about our own processes and compare them.
So let's start with something we all wrestle with the first draft. Let's talk about our relationship with that initial version of our stories.
And what about revision? Are we writers who edit as we go, or do we power through and clean it up later? I guess this is a question for all three of us, but what does our drafting process look like? What is our first draft in comparison to later drafts, I suppose? I can go first. So I power through a first draft after I outline for a little bit. I go off of a plan for that first draft. And then after that, I rewrite. I'll look back and analyze the things that I need to change, but I don't necessarily work off of that old draft because then I feel like I don't make substantial enough changes and my changes are more on the wording rather than the plot itself. I think I do that in later stages of revision when the plot is set and good, but from first to second and second to third draft, I do a lot of rewrites. How about you, Reagan?
Well, for the first initial draft, I do no editing. I write all the way through, just whatever comes to my mind, pretty much. And then in my second draft, I rewrite a lot. I actually completely deleted the first and second chapter of my novel, completely rewrote them, and just make changes wherever I feel are needed. And I've never gotten beyond a second draft, so
It's all right. For me, when I'm writing a first draft, I am initially just writing it to get all of the thoughts that I have down. Occasionally, I will go back through and edit that first draft, especially if I have an idea that I want to implement sooner because I have to work chronologically. Which is something I think, Reagan, you'll learn about me through this interview, is that that's one of my little writing quirks, and I need to know what happens first before I can move on to what's next. And so a lot of times, if I'm not like feeling in the mood to write, I'll go back and edit a little bit of my first draft, not extensively, not changing big plot points, more just of editing grammatical things, fixing sentences, which will help then get me back into the mood of writing. And then I read through that whole draft and I look at what's working, what's not working. And a lot of times, because I'm just kind of going, I find a lot of things don't work. And so going back in that second draft is a lot of moving things around, finding where the pieces all fit together.
Yeah, that kind of goes into my next question for everyone. Throughout the drafting process, we often find ourselves hitting walls. This could be writer's block, this could just be not knowing what happens next. How do you guys get around these things that are preventing us from writing the next few words?
I think I talked about this a little bit in my previous answer, and it's just getting back into that creative mood. And for me, it's usually just consuming fantasy in whatever form it takes. So, whether that be me reading a book that I really like, or me watching a movie that inspires me, or just rereading my own work to just get into that mindset, get inspired, get the creative juices flowing.
for me, it's pretty similar, I would say. One thing that I always like to fall back to whenever I'm struggling is Pinterest. It's always a favorite. It really puts my mind in the fantasy space. Pinterest has been really helpful, and as well as just keeping a consistent writing, even if what I feel like I'm writing isn't good. I just try and keep at it and not lose the rhythm of it, I suppose.
I feel like I relate a lot to that. Pinterest is such an underrated writing tool. Not only does it have a ton of fun prompts or a community of other writers on there, but it also just helps you visualize characters and things. I don't know how many pins my novella board has. Probably like 1,000 or something. There's so many. But yeah, I completely agree. I feel that if I want to get any serious amount done on my works, I have to be writing consistently. And if I don't, I find it a really hard time to get back into it. But I don't always have that luxury of a consistent writing routine because I've taken on a lot of things to do in life. But I also feel what I do if I'm struggling, not necessarily getting time to write or writing itself, but what to write. I take a break. I talk to my friends about it because they're just great springboards for ideas, especially my fantasy minded friends and whatnot. And then usually an idea comes out of that, and then I can continue. So, moving on, a big reason I have been really looking forward to this episode is I think the three of us are a really great depiction of the wide variety of writing processes out there, especially when it comes to writing fantasy. So, we've already kind of talked about our processes. Now, I want to put labels to our processes.
Definitely. Let's talk about labels. You may have heard of plotters and pantsers, which was coined by NaNoWriMo, or more formally, outline writers versus discovery writers.
Yeah, so let's dive into it. First, we're going to define what we mean when we say outliner, plotter, pantsters, or discovery writers. And then we'll discuss where each of us falls within these labels. So, I think we should start with outliners. So, an outline writer is the same as the NaNoWriMo term plotter. These are writers who prefer to plan before they write. Now, this happens on varying levels, but there is no full way to outline every single word you're going to write. So there is a little bit of improvisation that happens once you're actually on the page. But for the big plot, overarching plot things, the goals of each little scene, outline writers like to have that planned beforehand. And that plan might change, but that's just their process.
Discovery writers, on the other hand, tend to go with less of a structured process. They simply start writing on a page. Sometimes they might have a brief outline or some bullet points, but really it's left up to them in the moment to discover the story as they're writing.
Yeah, some famous examples of both. I know Stephen King is famous for being a discovery writer and being a big proponent of discovery writing. In his craft book on writing, which I really like, he makes the point that if you don't discovery write, you are killing your book. And you are losing the spark that you might otherwise have of discovering your plot as you go. I don't think that fits with everyone, but I think it just goes to show what his philosophy is. And then, I have to bring him up once every episode, but Brandon Sanderson is an outline writer. I don't think he's fully the largest outline writer out there, but he has talked about needing an outline more than your average discovery writer.
So now that we've defined what each type looks like, we're going to talk a little bit about how each of us fall into that category, because I know we actually cover pretty much the full range. So Abby, do you want to start with outline writing?
Yeah, so if you haven't been able to tell from all that I've said throughout every episode of this podcast, I'm an outline writer. Both in critical writing and creative writing, I have to have a plan of where I'm going, especially creative writing. Between every single draft I've done of my novella, I have written some form of an outline where I break it into scenes. I define what happens in each scene, what goal I want to achieve in each scene. And even as I'm sitting down on the page writing, often what I do is I come up with the flow of the scene, what I want my characters to say, but I don't exactly have the wording of it down yet. So this is a term I've coined, but I scan it out and I put everything that I want to happen in really poorly worded sentences that are just kind of like bullet points in brackets. So I'll scan out a whole scene. For example, if I'm having my two main characters argue and walk through the halls of the labyrinth, I will write beat for beat what happens. Usually, I'll do an entire scene at once. And then when I'm writing, I'll go through and expand upon that and actually write out the descriptions, what I want the prose to look like, what I want each character to say, and I'll delete each bracketed sentence as I get it done. So I have a big picture outline and then a little outline. But yeah, that's how I'm an outline writer.
But then we have the complete opposite side, which is discovery writer. And Reagan, I know you fall into this category, so do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I most definitely do fall into that category. I do very little outlining. I get a general idea of where the story is going, little points of where I want the scenes and different things, but I will often go outside of that even. I have introduced whole new characters without even meaning to, and changed the plot drastically so many times. I really enjoy just discovering it, as the title implies, discovering it as I write.
And that's so interesting because for me, I think I fall kind of right in between you two on the, let's call it, spectrum of writing processes. For me, I come up with a very basic outline of just key points that happen in the story that kind of fall along that common narrative arc. So things in the exposition, things in the rising action, the climax. And I basically say, I want this to happen somewhere in the story, and I want this to happen somewhere after that. And I give myself the freedom to discover what happens in between those 2 points in the moment as I am doing it. Because if I have no plan, then I don't write. And if I have too much of a plan, I feel like it takes a lot of the creativity out of it for me. So I have to have that perfect balance of knowing where I'm going while still letting me have the freedom to completely change that if I want.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I think a comparable example of this in between that you were talking about, Autumn, is the fantasy writer Robert Jordan, especially with his Wheel of Time series. I read somewhere that he had a small list of bullet points, plot wise, that he wanted to accomplish in what he wanted originally to be a trilogy. But because he was discovery writing in between these set points that he wanted to happen, the Wheel of Time series quickly expanded, and it's like, I want to say 10 or 11 books. But yeah, I really think it's so cool how different our processes are, even though we all write in the same long form fantasy genre. And I also think it's so cool that even the professionals in this field have such varied writing processes, and how every single process is valid as long as it is working for the writer.
It's really interesting to see how each of us approaches stories differently, but we still end up with these full narratives, just through very different paths. So let's shift to what our writing actually feels like once we've got a draft.
Yeah, while we all have different processes of composing our writing, let's talk about what makes our actual writing stand out. That is, what makes up each of our writing styles. So, to get into it, let's start by talking about how our writing processes influence our writing styles. Autumn, do you have any thoughts on that?
Definitely. I think for me, the biggest thing that happens when I'm writing is that even though I have this outline and these things I want to do, the characters end up driving the story a different way. So for my current novel that I'm working on, I initially had the two main characters meet in a stable and just travel together from there. But when I was actually writing the scene, I got to discover the characters and I got to know their intentions, and I realized these two characters would not trust each other by this point, and they would definitely not want to travel together. And so I completely rewrote that process and I rewrote it out of the draft. And I said, okay, oh no, now I have to figure out a way to get these characters to meet together now and to want to travel, and I have to come up with these motivations. So it was going back to that initial bullet point list and looking at what I want to do in the future and pushing it all back to add in a new scene where they reconnect and they are reintroduced to each other and finally have enough motivation to want to stick together.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because I have found a lot of my characters' voices not through discovering who they are as I'm writing, but discovering who they are after I'm done and looking back, big picture, and analyzing what I've written and going, oh, Farin wouldn't say that. Fate wouldn't say that. And then with the next draft, having the goal of, okay, I'm going to tweak it this way. But how about you, Reagan?
So my free writing style has definitely influenced the story in many ways. One way that stands out is I introduced a whole new character without meaning to. I originally had this young girl who was just seen by the main character. She was seen being treated poorly. I just wanted to show kind of what the place she was in was like. But then I realized that my main character would not have not stepped in. So I introduced a whole new character when my main character helped this young girl, and it changed the plot in several ways.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of similarities between us, and I think a big part of discovery writing is the characters take more control of the story than I think we as the authors do. And it really lets us dig into their voice and dig into the choices they've made, even though that might not have been the original plan we had in mind while we were writing.
Yeah, something I'm interested in, all of us as fantasy writers, is what our prose looks like when we're talking about writing style. Because I know fantasy is such a varied genre when it comes to what prose looks like. I guess I can start. My prose tends to be not very fancy. It tends to feel more modern than like ye olde, you know. I tend to write characters who are crass, and because especially my novella, because the most crass character is the first person viewpoint character, that is reflected in the prose. How about you guys?
So for me, I think my prose is really similar to yours. It's not this high, flowery language. It's a lot more natural how we actually speak. But the biggest thing that I've been trying to do with my writing is because my novel is set from the perspective of two characters and actually shifting the prose between the two. So my main character, Josie, is from the real world and she's transported into this fantasy world. And so a lot of her prose are a lot more modern lingo-y and driven. She'll say things that sound more natural to the reader as opposed to the people who actually inhabit this world. And while the people who inhabit this world, like the other character, he doesn't necessarily speak fancy or hoity-toity in a sense, but he has more formal, correct grammar when he speaks. And a lot of that has to do with trying to show the difference between their worlds and how they grew up, but also trying to just establish more distinct character voice. And I try and have not only the dialogue reflect this, but the prose itself. So whenever I'm describing how something looks through their eyes, Josie will make a lot of analogies to real world stuff. She'll reference cars or bikes or cell phones or a pair of jeans, while he might reference a horse drawn carriage.
I do have a question for you, Autumn. I should know this because I've read snippets, but it's been a while. And also for the sake of our audience, because I talked about my prose being in first person. Yours is very heavily influenced by its viewpoints, but I'm curious, is it in first person or is it in third?
It's in third person. I've always been a third person writer. It's just kind of how my brain is wired because my favorite authors also write in third person. And we as writers are heavily influenced by the people we enjoy consuming literature from. And so I often reflect the style of those authors in my own way. And those authors all tend to write third person.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I think doing a third person viewpoint, two third person viewpoints, and having the prose reflected through their viewpoints instead of doing third person omniscient is such a cool thing. And I just wanted to point that out. How about you, Reagan? What does your prose look like?
I feel like mine are fairly similar to yours, although I notice I tend to use a lot of like, from one of my characters at least, she uses a lot of metaphors and symbolisms, and because she kind of sees the world in a different way. While my other character is a bit more practical, he sees things more literally, kind of the way they are.
I think that's really cool being conscious of the figurative language you're using and how it can be a tool to show how the characters see the world. I think that kind of flows into my next question. What are some of the bigger picture elements of your writing style? Are you heavy on dialogue, heavy on action? Is the speed of your pacing something that's important to you? What are some just hallmarks of, oh, this was written by Autumn or Reagan or Abby?
I got this question. For me, I am very much a heavy dialogue person. It comes from one very specific thing, is that when I am thinking about scenes in my head, I will act them out loud. So oftentimes when I am in the shower, I am not singing songs, I am acting out scenes. Or when I am at work just cleaning, I am muttering under my breath different scenes between the characters because that's how I find that I discover their voices best. And it's, I think, part of that discovery aspect of, oh, this person says this thing, so how would this person react? And I think another big thing with my style is I tend to take my pacing fairly slow, which is painful for me because I just want to move on, move on, move on. But I like setting up things in advance, like way in advance. Like I am actively trying to set up things that will be in the third book of this trilogy right now in the first book, because I want readers to look back when they reread this and say, oh, she's known this all along. That's really cool and that's really smart. And so I tend to take things very slow, like painfully slow sometimes, where I'm going one day at a time, where I'm like, this character is going through this scene. Now this character is doing something that would happen immediately after that, and going back and forth and back and forth.
I also love my dialogue. I feel like I don't include as much of it, but I really enjoy those scenes, and I also will run through them in my head at least when I'm not writing, just kind of acting out the scene in a way with only words. I feel like I have parts that are fairly fast paced and then parts that go a lot slower. So it's just kind of a mix of both.
One thing I was thinking about as you were talking about this, because I know it's very true of my writing style, is that I focus really heavily on the relationship between characters. I think that's a hallmark of my style. So is that something you also focus on, Reagan, when you're writing?
Yeah, that most definitely is something I love to focus on, and I love playing with different relationships. Like, I love sibling relationships and romantic ones and parents and just exploring all the different types of human relationships.
How about you, Abby?
Well, I just wanted to say I think that is so cool. And I think fantasy is a great genre to explore relationships and what makes us human. Because even though it is in a different world, it's a great lens to look at the way people care for each other. But I think my hallmarks of my writing are very different from the two of you. I am a very action-based writer. I love having things happen. I'm not gonna say I write like at a breakneck pace, like thrillers or anything, but I always have things moving and happening. And it's to the point where a lot of the feedback I got on my first draft from my writing mentor was there's not enough happening in his head. There's so much action happening, and I am struggling to come up for air. You need to have him think and slow down. But I really love having things happen. I like writing fight scenes. I love huge stakes. Another hallmark of my writing. I tend to write characters who are bad people. I don't know why, but there's been this shift in my writing recently where I write characters who actively make really bad choices or who are not nice or who are just in terrible places in life. I think when I was younger, I used to write a lot of characters that were similar to me and were tween girls who were super smart and like goody two shoes. Oh, yeah, and another hallmark of my writing, I really like playing with existing tropes of things and putting my own twist on them. My novella is a really good example of that because I am kind of playing with what a chosen one can look like. So I feel like there's not enough stories out there about chosen ones who kind of suck, who are just bad people who abuse their power and have to learn their lesson about that. I wouldn't say I invert this trope, but I play with it. This short story that I'm writing that I'm hoping to expand someday about drag racing. Basically, long story short, the main character is a teenager and he gets his dad's old car. His dad's dead and he's grieving about his dad, but then his dad starts speaking to him through this car. I feel like there's a lot of stories out there about sentient cars at Stephen King, but I really wanted to kind of play with that and make it my own and make it less of a horror thing and more of a introspective, like let's deal with grief, let's make it more of an action type of story than a horror type of story, I suppose. So now that we've talked about some of the strengths of our writing styles, let's get a little more personal. Let's talk about some of the weaknesses and areas we're trying to improve on our styles because, as writers, we're always learning more, we're always improving.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is because I let characters often drive what happens in the story, and that sometimes leads me off of my initial bullet points, my initial track of where I was going. It leads to a lot of times me not knowing what to do next or how to get back on track to where I'm going. And sometimes that creates a little bit of writer's block because I had this one thing in mind and then I let the characters do what the characters would do, and it makes for a better story in the end. But it's that waiting period of trying to figure out, okay, if I made this choice, if the characters made this choice, how am I going to get back on track or get us to where I still want them to go without completely changing the whole overarching path, which sometimes does happen because stories grow as you write them. And I think it's a crucial step to any writing that the initial plan you have inevitably gets thrown out the window. Because as you're writing, especially for, I feel like, discovery writers, new things come up, better ideas happen. And that's even true of like outline writers when you're doing rewrites, which I know I've seen through Abby's novella several times.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think because I'm an outline writer, I'm really good at sticking to plot and having a driving sense of action in my stories. But because that is my strength, my weakness, like I've kind of touched on earlier, is having those slower moments to have character beats, having characters be a lot more introspective, especially because I like to write in first person a lot. A good hallmark of first person is the story being told through the eyes and the voice and the thoughts of the spotlight character. And I often have to force myself to slow down, and I struggle a lot with figuring out what my character is thinking in moments because I can only visualize what my character is doing. And I really have to, it takes me a lot longer to know where to put the thoughts, what the thoughts are even saying, as opposed to what my characters are doing and what they're saying to each other.
How about you, Reagan?
Well, one of my major weaknesses when writing is I like to tell the reader what is happening rather than showing it most of the time. I feel like that's a skill that will come as I continue to write and just learn as I do it.
I feel like that's completely fair. Being able to just tell a reader what is happening, though, I think is an important skill. I think the piece of advice of show don't tell only works in certain scenarios because if you're showing everything, that takes up so many more words and so much more time, and books can't just be 2,000 pages as much as I would love it to be. I have a hard time just telling if I need to just say the character walked across the room and shut the door. I tend to zoom in on that more than I need to. But, I think we're all figuring out that balance as we're writing.
I think talking about weaknesses is actually really empowering because we're all learning and the process is never really done evolving.
Totally. And the more we understand our own habits, the good and the bad, the more we can work with them instead of against them.
So we've talked a lot about process, but with fantasy writing, there is a whole extra layer that we haven't even touched on yet, that being world building.
Ah, yes, the endless rabbit hole of maps, languages, magic systems, kingdoms, religions, and weirdly specific calendar systems. And somehow, all of it has to serve the story, or it just becomes a giant wiki that no one ever reads.
So let's dive into it. First off, why is world building such a pillar of fantasy writing, and why do we talk about it less in other genres?
Yeah, starting off, I just think it's because that is one of the key defining points of fantasy, high fantasy specifically. So, for those listeners who may not know the term high fantasy as opposed to low fantasy, high fantasy takes place in a setting that is not our current world today. Low fantasy is, our world today, but with some sort of fantastical element. But high fantasy, you have to develop the world, and keeping that world consistent and interesting is such a big factor. And that's, I think, what makes fantasy and science fiction so different than some of these other genres. Yeah, so with that foundation kind of built, let's talk about our own world building. Where does each of our world building begin, and what specifically in our world building are we interested in? So, magic, politics, culture, environment, all those good things.
Well, my very favorite part of world building is the history. I love creating complex histories and seeing how they tie into the current story. And I even want to turn one of my stories into its own book eventually. I tend to use magic systems, finding complex ways to fix problems.
I think specifically the way you implement magic systems, Reagan, reminds me Brandon Sanderson is kind of famous for coining his own rules of how magic systems should be implemented in writing. And I forget which one of those rules it is, but one of them is the ability of your readers to understand the magic system is directly proportionate to its ability to solving problems. So having your magic be a source of problem solving, I think is really cool and really valuable. It's something that I know I need to work on. I do implement a lot of magic, but my magic tends to be less rule based and just kind of what I want to do with it. Aspect of world building that I really like is afterlife and deities and that kind of realm of magic and how that works. I think that's simply because it is central to how my novella works because the main character dies in the first scene and it mostly takes place in the afterlife. But I think fantasy can do a lot of really cool things with death and what happens after death and what fictional deities can look like and can do, because mine are really nerfed. They are not very powerful, and I have a lot of fun with that. They have a lot of limitations. How about you, Autumn?
For me, because my current work in progress is about a girl who's transported to a magical world that currently doesn't have magic, and she supposedly has magic, but she doesn't have magic currently. And so it's all about magic with no actual magic. And so I think I focus a lot more on the way magic has left and the scar that leaves on the world itself and how it's affected the culture and the people, and putting a heavy emphasis on the difference between the real world and the culture of this other world, and showing that through the things the characters say, the things they do, what they sell, how the world looks itself. Because I don't have magic to play with yet.
Quick question for you guys. Have any of you ever gotten too deep into the world building and forgotten about, the plot?
Oh, yeah, definitely. When I was playing out my novel, I spent a lot of time focusing in on the world building because I am creating this whole new world. And so I didn't write anything for like a good year because I was just coming up with more scenarios in my head to fill out this world, to add more history to it, and to give it a little bit of flavor without actually doing anything with it.
I would say I do that for sure. With some of my old stories, I used to get so caught up in all of that stuff. I ended up writing so many side stories away from my main book series. So I just had a whole bunch of side stories that just go on about all of the little details that I didn't want people to miss.
Yeah, I feel like getting caught up in the world building and the fun that it is such a relatable thing for most fantasy writers. Brandon Sanderson calls this world builder's disease, where you do way more world building than you're actually writing. But for some people, I think it works. I mean, it worked for Tolkien. Tolkien spent years developing everything in Middle Earth. So I want to move into kind of a rapid fire section. What is one world building win that you guys have had? And then what's one world building fail that you guys have had? I can go first. So I'll start with my fail. I think I've kind of talked about this before, but I developed a setting in the afterlife. So Fate is a character in my world, and the setting that I had Fate live in and interact with was this labyrinth that supposedly was going to be made of this amalgamation of every single type of building material, and it just kind of flows into the next, and it looked really cool in my head, but putting it on the page was really choppy, hard to visualize, and hard to implement. So that was one of my fails, but I think one of my wins, I kind of mentioned this previously a little bit, was the system I built with my fictional deities. I call it the Concordant. Basically, little spoiler for my work that is not published. The gods, there's two, and they have very limited abilities because they almost destroyed the world with their full length of abilities. So they decided to agree to give up some of their powers and give their powers to other people. I'm not sounding very articulate when I talk about it, but just know it's a really, really cool thing. It's so cool, in fact, that Autumn kind of repurposed it for our D&D campaign.
I did indeed do that. I think for me, if we're talking about world building wins versus fails, I think the place that's most applicable for me is in our D&D setting. And one of those, I wouldn't say fails, but I kind of borrowed this idea that Abby had about this concordant, and I spun it in a way where the gods of the D&D world can't interact with the physical world because they made this agreement after a war. But earlier, before I made that decision, one of the gods kind of already did interact with one of the characters by healing them. And so we just pretend that didn't happen. But I think world building win for me, something I'm super proud of. In my novel, the whole history of the gods that is going to be told through this tapestry that's hanging in the palace. I'm so proud of that because it is really cool and really in depth. And there's some things that are really cool that are behind it that I can't talk about yet because that'll be in book 2 and book 3. I don't want spoilers. And who knows? I might change it still. It's not for sure. Everything is fluid right now, but I am so incredibly proud of the goddesses of this world and how in depth I went into their lore and some of the things that came about because of it, because it ended up propelling the story forward and giving me more things to do in future books.
One of my world building wins, as I've mentioned before, is the history that I've created for my current novel. I feel like I end up liking it almost more than my original story. And it really ties into what's currently happening and adds a lot more emotion, I feel like. But then it kind of also ties into my fail, where I struggle to kind of connect this past to the present in some ways, where with the history, with the past and the present, I need the magic systems to be fluid, but I don't want the main characters now to have the same kinds of magic. And so that's something I'm still working on.
You know, that's so real. That is a problem I also have with my current story is trying to translate a world that once had magic to a place that now doesn't and coming up with a solid reasoning behind it.
I think that's so cool. It's a hallmark of our genre that we're contributing to is magic, obviously, and all the super cool things that we can do as we're having our characters learn about the world and build relationships and fail and start over.
Honestly, though, that's the beauty of writing fantasy, isn't it? World building can be messy, magical, frustrating, and fun, and the best part is it's yours.
Reagan, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. It was awesome getting to hear how you bring your stories to life and talking about how that connects to us too as fantasy writers, whether we've got a plan or whether we're discovering it one word at a time. And that wraps it up for today's episode of The Right Angle, where we know the real story is in the process, not the product.
Until next time, write boldly, revise gently, and stay weird.